The bus rolled toward the stop on a cool morning in early autumn. The sky was pale and flat, the kind of color that made the streetlights look tired as they blinked off one by one. Mr. Clarence Brooks stood at the edge of the curb with his hand resting on the top of his cane. He watched the bus approach and felt the familiar small knot of relief in his chest. As long as that route kept running, his world still had shape. Clarence had built his life around that ride. The bus carried him to the grocery store, to the clinic, to the small park where he liked to sit on a bench and let his knees rest. It was not a long route, but it was his route. He had learned the faces of the regular drivers and many of the passengers. Most mornings moved in a quiet rhythm. He boarded, tapped his senior pass against the reader, nodded to the driver, and found one of the seats near the front where his legs had enough room. That morning began the same way. He wore his dark wool coat and the flat cap his grandchildren had given him last winter. His senior pass rested in the slim pocket of his wallet, tucked behind a photo of his late wife. He had checked the time twice before leaving his apartment, making sure he would reach the stop a few minutes before the bus. Losing that routine felt unthinkable. It was more than habit. It was dignity. The bus hissed as it came to a stop. The doors folded open with a soft gasp. Warm air rolled out toward the sidewalk. Clarence climbed the first step, one hand on the rail, and reached into his coat. He pulled out his wallet, slid the card free, and extended it toward the driver. The driver that day was not one of the familiar faces. He was a white man in his 40s with a short haircut and a jaw set in a way that suggested permanent impatience. He glanced at the card in Clarence's hand and did not move the reader closer. He simply stared at the plastic, as if it were a problem instead of a pass. Clarence held the card steady. He felt the line of passengers forming behind him. He expected the driver to lean forward and tap the reader against the card. Instead, the driver reached out, took the card from Clarence's fingers, and turned it over in his hand several times. His eyes crawled across the faded print as if he were searching for a reason not to accept it. The bus grew quiet. The low murmur of passenger voices faded. People watched the small scene at the front, the way people do when trouble begins without warning. Clarence kept his shoulders straight. He had stood in lines before where people in uniforms took their time deciding whether he was allowed to pass. He had promised himself long ago that he would not let that old feeling own him. Still, he felt the familiar heat rise behind his ribs. The driver announced that the card did not look right. He claimed that the system had been having trouble with fraudulent passes. He added that he could not accept something that looked tampered with. He did not point to any crack or scratch or missing mark. He did not explain what part of the worn plastic had triggered his suspicion. He simply spoke with the authority that comes from sitting in a seat above other people. Clarence told him in a level voice that this was the same card he had used for years. He mentioned that the transit office had mailed it to him after processing his application. He explained that the card had worked on this route and other routes without a problem. The driver remained unmoved. He said that it did not scan and that, in his opinion, it might be fake. The sound of the word fake, spoken in a casual tone in that confined space, landed on Clarence like a stone. He thought of the forms he had filled out to get that card. He thought of the medical records he had handed over to prove that his income and age qualified him. He thought of the woman at the transit office window who had told him that this card would help him stay independent for as long as possible. All of that history was now reduced to a stranger's quick judgment. Passengers behind Clarence began to shuffle and sigh. Some rolled their eyes, eager for the delay to end. A young woman near the front shifted her phone in her hand and angled the camera slightly toward the interaction. She did not raise it high. She did not speak. She simply began to record. The driver announced that Clarence would have to pay a regular fare in cash or step off the bus. Clarence explained that his budget did not allow him to pay full fare every time, and that the whole point of the senior pass was to make the service accessible. He held out the card again and asked the driver to simply tap it against the reader and see the confirmation on the screen. The driver refused. He declared that he would not risk being responsible for accepting something that looked suspicious. He used the word suspicious in a flat, practiced way, as if it were neutral. To Clarence, it carried decades of weight. It reminded him of store managers who had followed him down aisles in his youth. It echoed the tones of officers who had once told him that his very presence on a sidewalk after dark raised questions. Clarence felt the bus sway slightly as the driver shifted in his seat. The driver picked up the small radio handset mounted near his shoulder. Without taking his eyes off Clarence, he contacted dispatch. His voice took on a sharper edge. He reported that there was an uncooperative passenger at the front of his bus. He stated that the passenger was presenting a card that appeared fraudulent. He asked for police assistance at the next major intersection. Clarence heard the words uncooperative and fraudulent and felt as if the floor had tilted. He had not raised his voice. He had not moved closer to the driver. He had not made any threat. Yet in a few short breaths, he had been recast as a problem requiring police. The passengers now understood that they were no longer just late. They were witnesses. Some looked away, as if distance could make responsibility dissolve. Others leaned closer, curiosity overriding discomfort. The young woman with the phone kept recording. Clarence made a choice in that moment that would shape everything that followed. He remembered younger days when anger had flared fast. He remembered how quickly that anger had been turned against him. On the bus, he let the anger slide behind a harder thing. He clung to clarity. He stood his ground without stepping forward. He stated once more that his card was valid, that he had every right to ride, and that if the driver had questions, they could be answered without calling the police. The driver kept his hand on the radio. He informed Clarence that the matter was no longer just about the card. He asserted that refusing to follow his instructions was itself a violation of transit rules. The logic felt familiar and twisted. First, Clarence's right to be there was called into question. Next, his insistence on that right was framed as disobedience. The bus rolled to the requested intersection and stopped near the curb. Outside, morning traffic continued to slide past. Inside, time thickened. A few passengers asked quietly if they could exit through the back door to catch other rides. The driver allowed some to leave, but told others to stay seated. His decisions seemed arbitrary. They carried the message that he, not the timetable, controlled the next chapter of this ride. Within a short span, a police cruiser pulled up behind the bus. The blue and red lights remained off, but the car's presence filled the mirrors. Two officers approached the open front door. Both were white. Both wore the usual layers of uniform and gear that turned human shape into something more imposing. They stepped into the bus and took in the scene. An older black man standing near the fare box, a driver seated above him, a cluster of passengers watching with tense attention. The driver spoke first. He framed the situation before Clarence could present any context. He described a passenger with a suspicious card who had refused to comply with instructions and was holding up the route. The taller officer turned his gaze on Clarence. He asked why Clarence did not simply pay the fare in cash and sort out the card issue later. His tone suggested that this would be the reasonable path. Clarence felt the old pressure again, the one that asked him to surrender not only money, but also truth, so that other people could remain comfortable. Clarence explained, as calmly as he could, that the card was his legally issued senior pass. He noted that he had used it for years without trouble. He described the driver's refusal to even test it against the reader. He added that he lived on a fixed income and that paying full fare every time would not be sustainable. The officer listened for a moment, then shifted the focus. He said that transit rules gave drivers authority to decide who boarded and under what conditions. He suggested that Clarence's refusal to obey the driver's direction placed Clarence at risk of being removed under trespass laws. The officer's words rearranged the story in real time. The questionable action of the driver receded. The alleged disobedience of the passenger moved to the front. Clarence's legs ached. Standing for this long without moving to a seat sent a dull throb up from his knees. He tightened his grip on the pole. He thought of the clinic appointment he would miss if this scene continued. He thought of the thin margin in his bank account. He thought of every moment in his life when swallowing an injustice had been the price of getting home in one piece. He chose not to raise his voice. He chose not to step closer. He chose not to reach into his pockets quickly. He knew too well how fast fear could ignite in the eyes of an officer who had already decided that a black man's calm was a mask for something else. He simply repeated that his card was valid and that he hoped someone, somewhere in the system, could check the record. The shorter officer asked Clarence to step off the bus so they could talk on the sidewalk. The driver watched with a satisfied tilt to his posture, as if his earlier suspicion had been confirmed by the mere arrival of uniforms. Clarence stepped down slowly. His cane made a small, hollow sound on the pavement. The young woman with the phone repositioned herself to keep filming through the open door. On the sidewalk, the officers took his card and his identification. One remained near Clarence, while the other returned to the cruiser to run checks through the computer. Cars flowed past in the next lane. Drivers glanced over at the sight of an older black man standing under watch beside a bus. Some looked away quickly, unwilling to let their commute be contaminated by someone else's trouble. Others stared longer, secure behind glass. The officer near Clarence asked questions in a rehearsed pattern. He inquired where Clarence was headed, why he relied on the bus, whether he had ever had issues with transit before. None of these questions addressed the main point. All of them gathered threads that could be woven into a narrative of suspicion, if needed. Clarence answered without embellishment. He told the officer that he had served in the army many years earlier as a mechanic. He mentioned that he had worked decades in a local plant until his knees and back made that impossible. He stated that the bus was his only practical way to reach the clinic that monitored his blood pressure and his heart. The other officer returned from the cruiser. He announced that the identification appeared valid and that there were no outstanding warrants. He held up the senior pass and remarked that the transit system database listed it as active. The word active slipped into the air with quiet force. The bus driver had stepped down onto the pavement by this time. He heard the officer's statement and stiffened. He responded quickly, insisting that the reader inside the bus had rejected the card. He maintained that his concern had been about the possibility of a malfunctioning or altered pass, not about the passenger himself. The officer who held the card glanced between the driver and Clarence. A small frown creased his forehead. He looked at the card once more, this time as a simple object rather than a symbol. The bus route number and transit logo were faded but clear. The printed name matched the identification. The database check confirmed validity. Without saying so, the evidence contradicted the driver's earlier claim. Clarence watched this silent recalculation unfold. He felt no satisfaction, only exhaustion. The officers conferred quietly near the cruiser. The bus remained idling, its door open, passengers peering out from their seats. Time continued to slip away from Clarence's day. Eventually, the taller officer returned the card and identification to Clarence. He informed him that as far as the police were concerned, there was no reason to detain him further. He added, however, that the decision about whether Clarence would ride that particular bus remained with the driver. Clarence heard the words and understood their shape. The system had acknowledged that he was not a criminal, yet left his access to essential transportation in the hands of the man who had just treated him like one. The driver, when asked, announced that he did not feel comfortable allowing Clarence back on board. He cited the earlier disruption at the front of the bus as justification. The officers did not challenge that choice. They stepped aside. The bus doors closed. The vehicle pulled away from the curb, leaving Clarence on the sidewalk with his cane, his card, and a deep, cold vacancy where trust had once lived. The young woman with the phone walked over. She introduced herself and explained that she had recorded the entire interaction from the moment the driver first questioned the card. She said that she knew how these things could be twisted in reports if no independent record existed. She offered to share the video with Clarence and his family. Clarence thanked her. His voice came out rougher than he intended. He accepted her contact information on a small scrap of paper and tucked it into his wallet beside the photo of his wife. He made his way slowly back toward his apartment, each step heavier than the last. The clinic appointment would have to be rescheduled. The damage done to his body that morning was less visible than a missed dose of medication, but no less real. At home, Clarence sat at his kitchen table and laid the senior pass in front of him. The card looked the same as it had that morning, as it had the day it arrived in the mail. Yet now it carried the echo of a stranger's suspicion. He stared at it until the letters blurred, and he closed his eyes. His granddaughter arrived later that afternoon. She was in her 30s, with a direct gaze and an energy that seemed to fill any room she entered. She listened as Clarence described what had happened. As he spoke, she watched his hands. They trembled slightly when he mentioned the word suspicious. They tightened into loose fists when he recalled being left on the sidewalk while the bus drove away. She felt a familiar mixture of anger and fear. She had grown up hearing stories from him about marches, about sit-ins, about officers who had wielded their authority like a club. She had believed, or wanted to believe, that his grandchildren's generation would not have to watch him relive those scenes in new forms. Now, the present had caught up with the past. She asked if anyone had recorded the incident. Clarence handed her the slip of paper from the young woman on the bus. His granddaughter contacted the number that evening. Within hours, the video file arrived in her email. She sat with Clarence and watched it together. The footage began with the driver examining the card with exaggerated care. It captured Clarence standing patiently, explaining his history with the pass. It showed the driver refusing to test the card, calling it suspicious, before any device had been used. The sound was clear enough to pick up the driver's tone, the murmurs from the seats, the moment when the word fraudulent was used into the radio. The video then followed the officer's arrival, the conversation on the bus, the slow movement to the sidewalk. The camera shook when the young woman shifted in her seat, but the essence of the exchange remained visible and audible. It caught the moment when one officer announced that the card was active in the system. It caught the driver's insistence that he still did not want Clarence on his bus. It ended with the bus pulling away and Clarence standing alone. Clarence watched the recording with a strange double consciousness. He was both the man in the frame and a viewer witnessing someone else's ordeal. He noticed small details he had missed in the moment, such as the way one passenger had stared at his shoes the entire time, unwilling to meet his eyes. He saw the tightness in the driver's mouth, the little flinch when the database check contradicted his assumption. His granddaughter paused the video and looked at him. She told him that this was not something they could simply let pass. She explained that there were complaint procedures for transit incidents, that there were civil rights offices in the city, that there were lawyers who specialized in discrimination cases. Clarence felt tired. He had fought battles before. He had hoped that those old fights had purchased a quieter old age. Yet he could see in her face that not fighting now would carve its own wound. Together, they filed a formal complaint with the transit agency. The online form asked for dates, times, route numbers, driver descriptions. It offered small text boxes in which to condense a morning that had felt like an hour stretched into a day. They attached the video file. They submitted the report and received an automatic message promising that someone would review the case. Days passed. Life did not pause to honor forms. Clarence still needed groceries. He still needed to reach the clinic. He hesitated the first morning he approached the bus stop again. He ran his thumb over the surface of the senior pass. The memory of standing on the sidewalk with police nearby still prickled in his skin. He considered staying home. He refused to let fear shrink his world. When a different bus arrived with a different driver, he boarded with a mix of caution and resolve. This driver barely glanced at him. He pressed the reader toward the card. The device beeped, a small, bright sound of acceptance. The driver nodded and focused on the road. The pass worked exactly as intended. The incident from the earlier morning smelled even more like something other than policy. After nearly 2 weeks, the transit agency responded. The message arrived by email and by physical letter. It used careful language. It stated that the agency had reviewed the incident. It acknowledged that a passenger had felt unfairly treated. It noted that the driver recalled the situation differently than the passenger, and that there had been some confusion about the card reader's response that morning. The letter concluded that the agency had reminded the driver about customer service expectations and considered the matter resolved. Clarence read the letter and felt his jaw tighten. His granddaughter read it and nearly shook with anger. The word resolved, used that way, felt like another small theft. The agency had compressed his humiliation into a line about confusion. It had protected the driver's version of events by treating his memory as equal to the combination of video evidence and database records. Clarence's granddaughter refused to accept that answer. She dug into the transit agency website, looking for any mention of how records were stored. She found references to onboard cameras, farebox logs, and internal incident reports. She discovered that the city maintained a process for public records requests. She drafted a request for footage from the bus camera on the date and time of the incident, for the driver's written report, and for any internal messages between the driver and supervisors about senior passes. The weeks that followed revealed a kind of slow-motion resistance. The agency responded that some records would take time to locate. They claimed that certain emails might be exempt from disclosure. They said that video footage was retained only for a limited period and might no longer be available. The language felt slippery in familiar ways. It spoke of systems and policies rather than of people and accountability. Clarence's granddaughter enlisted help. She contacted a local legal clinic that specialized in civil rights and elder law. A young attorney there listened to the story, watched the passenger video, and agreed that something was wrong. The attorney filed a more formal records request, citing specific provisions that required preservation of evidence once a complaint had been lodged. Under pressure, the transit agency began to release documents. First came the driver's incident report. In it, he described a passenger who had become agitated, who had raised his voice, who had stepped too close to the driver's seat. He claimed that he had feared for his safety and for the safety of others. He stated that the card had clearly failed to register on the reader and that he had reasonable grounds to suspect tampering. The attorney compared the report with the passenger video. The differences were stark. The video showed Clarence maintaining a steady distance, his voice quiet, his hands visible at all times. It showed no attempt by the driver to test the card. It captured the casual use of terms like suspicious and fraudulent long before any device had been consulted. The report, in contrast, framed the passenger as the source of escalation. Next came a batch of emails from the transit depot. Most were mundane scheduling notes and maintenance notices. Buried among them, however, was a message thread from the week before the incident. In that thread, a supervisor reminded drivers that there had been attempts in other cities to defraud transit systems using copied or altered senior passes. The supervisor did not provide evidence of any such attempts in their own city. The email nonetheless urged drivers to be extra cautious with passes that looked worn or old. Another message, sent by a different supervisor a few days later, added a line that made Clarence's granddaughter's stomach turn. It suggested that drivers should be especially vigilant with passengers who did not present in a way that matched expectations for local seniors. The phrase was vague enough to provide cover, sharp enough to communicate a bias to anyone inclined to hear it. The attorney looked at that line, then at Clarence sitting across the table from him. He saw an older black man whose very existence on that bus had apparently been enough to trigger suspicion under a coded directive. He decided that this case was no longer just about one driver's judgment. It had become a window into how an entire system signaled who belonged and who did not. The attorney filed a formal complaint with the city's civil rights office. He alleged that Clarence had been discriminated against on the basis of race and age. He cited the video, the database check showing the card's validity, the driver's report, and the internal emails. He requested a public hearing. News of the case began to spread. The young woman who had filmed the incident shared her video on a social media platform with Clarence's permission. She posted it with a short description of what she had witnessed. The clip showed an older man being treated like a criminal for presenting a legal pass. It showed a driver insisting on his power even when confronted with evidence that undercut his claim. It showed police officers giving more weight to a worker's discomfort than to a passenger's humiliation. The video gained attention quickly. People shared it with captions expressing outrage and weary recognition. Other seniors recounted times when their passes had been questioned without clear reason. Some Black elders described avoiding certain routes or times of day because they had grown tired of the looks and the challenges. The story moved from one corner of the internet to local news. A reporter from a city station contacted Clarence and his attorney. She visited his apartment, sat at the same kitchen table where he had once stared at his card in silence, and recorded an interview. Clarence spoke slowly, choosing his words with the care of someone who understood how quickly a story could be twisted. He described how it felt to be told, at his age, that he did not belong on a bus he had ridden for years. He spoke of the quiet insult buried in the assumption that a Black elder on a fixed income would risk everything to ride for free. The segment aired that evening. It included portions of the passenger video, statements from the transit agency, and a brief comment from a spokesperson who had been sent to respond on camera. The spokesperson repeated that the agency took all complaints seriously and was committed to fairness. He asserted that the driver had believed he was following guidance. He declined to comment on the internal emails, citing ongoing review. Clarence watched the broadcast with his granddaughter. Something shifted in him as he saw his face on the screen, heard his own voice describe the morning that had cracked his routine. The story was no longer just his private wound. It had become a symbol for others. That knowledge added weight and also offered a strange kind of support. If he kept going, he would not be walking alone. The Civil Rights Office scheduled a hearing. It would not be held in a grand courtroom. It would take place in a modest meeting room in a municipal building, with folding chairs and a long table. Yet what happened there would matter. It would produce a record beyond the transit agency's initial letter of resolution. On the day of the hearing, Clarence arrived with his attorney and his granddaughter. He wore his best suit, the one he had kept carefully pressed for weddings, funerals, and now this unexpected category of event. The hallway outside the room held more people than he had expected. A few were reporters, some were elders from his church. A couple of neighbors had taken time off work to attend. The young woman who had filmed the video stood near the back, her phone lowered at her side. Inside, representatives from the transit agency sat together. The driver who had refused Clarence's pass was present. He looked smaller without the bus seat beneath him. A lawyer for the agency shuffled papers. A city official convened the hearing, reminding everyone that the purpose was to examine whether Clarence had been subjected to unfair treatment and whether agency practices needed revision. Clarence's attorney presented the case in a steady sequence. He outlined the basic facts of the morning. He played the passenger video on a screen at the front of the room. He contrasted the footage with excerpts from the driver's written report. He walked through the internal emails, pausing on the line about seniors who did not present as expected. As the video played, the room grew very quiet. People watched the moment when the driver first called the card suspicious without having tried the reader. They saw the officers step onto the bus and accept the driver's framing. They watched Clarence being led off, the card still untested. They observed the flash of surprise on one officer's face when the database listed the card as active. They heard the driver still refuse to allow Clarence to ride. Clarence did not look at the screen. He kept his eyes on his hands, folded on the table. He had lived that morning once already. Seeing it again through other people's eyes was a cost he did not need to pay twice. He listened instead to the small sounds in the room, the sharp intake of breath from someone when the word fraudulent surfaced, the barely muffled sigh when the bus door closed on him. The transit agency's lawyer responded by emphasizing the supervisor's earlier warnings about fraudulent passes in other cities. He argued that drivers had to make quick judgments to protect the system. He framed the internal email about expectations as an unfortunate choice of words rather than an instruction with bias. He acknowledged that the card had turned out to be valid, but insisted that the driver had been acting in good faith based on the information available at the time. Clarence's attorney countered that the most important information available at the time had never been consulted. The reader had not been used. The driver's eyes had substituted for the machine. Those eyes, informed by an email soaked in coded language, had settled on a black elder and found suspicion where none existed. Good faith, the attorney argued, did not excuse a pattern of ignoring tools designed to prevent exactly this type of prejudice. Members of the Civil Rights Office asked questions. They inquired whether drivers received training on implicit bias. They pressed the agency on why the initial review had not mentioned the email about how seniors presented. They asked what steps would be taken to ensure that a valid card, confirmed by the system, could not again be overridden by a driver's unease. Clarence was invited to speak near the end. He rose slowly. He felt the eyes on him and the years on his back. He did not recite slogans. He did not try to compress his entire life into a few sentences. He simply described how it had felt to stand on that bus and realize that in the driver's mind, everything he had done to follow the rules weighed less than the snap judgment written on his skin. He told the panel that the bus was not a luxury for him. It was a bridge. It connected him to medicine, to food, to the small pleasures of sitting in a park and nodding to strangers. When someone could pull that bridge away on a whim and call the police to guard the gap, it did more than delay a day. It damaged trust in every system that claimed to serve elders like him. The hearing did not end with a gavel. It ended with promises of written findings to come. Clarence walked out into the hallway and found himself surrounded by people who wanted to shake his hand, pat his shoulder, or simply say that they had seen and believed what had happened. The young woman with the phone thanked him for allowing her recording to be used. Elders from his church told him that his fight was theirs. Weeks later, the Civil Rights Office issued its report. It found that Clarence had been subjected to disparate treatment. It concluded that the driver had failed to follow basic verification procedures. It noted that internal emails had contributed to an atmosphere in which certain seniors were viewed with unwarranted suspicion. It recommended that the transit agency provide training on bias, revise its guidance, and establish clearer consequences when drivers bypassed verification systems. The report carried no direct penalty. Its power lay in its public nature. The findings reached local news, then state advocacy groups. Organizations focused on elder rights and racial justice cited the case as an example of how bias could operate quietly in everyday services. They used it to push for broader reforms. Clarence's attorney pursued a separate civil claim. After negotiations that stretched through several months, the transit agency agreed to a settlement. It included monetary compensation for Clarence and a commitment to cover his transit needs for the rest of his life at no cost. More importantly to him, it required the agency to adopt new protocols. Drivers would be trained to always use the card reader before making judgments about a pass. Complaints of discrimination would trigger automatic preservation of video and logs. Internal messages about fraud prevention would be reviewed by an oversight committee to strip out coded language. The driver who had refused Clarence's pass faced disciplinary action. The agency did not disclose all details, citing personnel privacy, but it confirmed that he would no longer be assigned to frontline routes without additional training. For Clarence, this mattered less than the knowledge that other elders, stepping onto buses with their own worn cards, might not have to live his mourning. Months after the hearing, on another cool day, Clarence stood again at the bus stop. His cane felt familiar in his hand. His senior pass now rested in a small plastic sleeve to protect it further, though the agency had offered to replace it. He had chosen to keep the original. It carried too much history to throw away. When the bus arrived, the driver that day was a middle-aged woman who greeted him with a nod and a brief smile. She extended the reader without comment. He tapped his card. The device beeped in acceptance. No one questioned the validity of the plastic or the person holding it. Clarence moved to his usual seat near the front. As the bus pulled away, he watched the city slide past the window. Storefronts, clinics, small churches, and clusters of apartments stitched together the landscape of his life. He felt the familiar soft sway of the ride, and beneath it, a steadier sense that something had shifted. if only by inches. His granddaughter had told him that somewhere in the transit headquarters, new posters now hung in break rooms. They reminded staff that passes, like people, carried stories that could not be read at a glance. Training sessions had been updated to include his case as an example of what must not be repeated. Policy documents had been amended. Card readers would now be checked before assumptions hardened into calls for police. None of this erased what had happened. The memory of standing on the sidewalk while the bus doors closed would remain. Yet in the wide arc of his years, Clarence had learned that some scars could become maps. They could show others where the dangers lay and how to walk differently. On that ride, no one knew that the quiet black elder near the front had taken on a transit system and won changes that would outlast him. To most passengers, he was simply another senior with a pass, another rider watching the world through scratched glass. For Clarence, that ordinary anonymity was not an insult. It was a kind of victory. Being able to board a bus, tap a card, and find a seat without being turned into a suspect felt, after everything, like a form of justice he could hold in his own hands, as solid and simple as the plastic card that had started it all.